What if the father of modern psychology wasn't actually a scientist at all, but a modern-day myth maker?
Right, it's a massive question.
Yeah, like, what if your therapist's couch has more in common with an ancient Greek temple than a medical laboratory? Today, we are unpacking a really brutal, radical critique that attempts to completely dismantle Sigmund Freud.
It is a massive paradigm shift, honestly. I mean, we have this deep-seated assumption that stepping into a therapist's office is a rigorous clinical process.
Oh, absolutely.
We treat the mind like an engine, and, well, the doctor is the mechanic who understands the biology. But today's source argues that the entire diagnostic landscape of psychoanalysis is just a mythological illusion.
Welcome to today's deep dive. Our mission today is to explore a fascinating, highly critical, and historically significant essay. It's titled Freud, A Study in Bourgeois Psychology. And just to translate that title for anyone who doesn't spend their weekends reading political theory, bourgeois in this context basically refers to a worldview centered entirely around the capitalist, property-owning middle and upper classes. This single essay challenges everything you might think you know about therapy, society, and the human mind. Okay, let's unpack this.
But before we jump into the deep end, we need to pause for a very important disclaimer, speaking directly to you, the listener.
Yeah, this is crucial.
The source text we're analyzing today contains highly politically charged material. It is a very specific Marxist and communist critique of capitalist society.
Right.
And it even goes so far as to allege ties between Freud's theories and the rise of fascism.
So we want to be crystal clear here. We are absolutely not taking sides. We are not endorsing these political views, and we are condemning them either.
Definitely not.
Our job is simply to impartially report and analyze the arguments exactly as they are presented in the original source material. We're doing this strictly for the sake of intellectual exploration to see how this specific historical lens interprets the foundation of modern psychology.
So, with that understood, we can look at how this text fundamentally strips Freud of his white coat. The essay makes a very specific historical comparison. It places Freud not next to a modern scientist like Isaac Newton, but next to the early astronomer Johannes Kepler.
Kepler's an interesting choice. I mean, he's the astronomer who figured out the actual laws of planetary motion, right?
Exactly. But the essay points out that he lived in this highly religious age. Kepler apparently believed a divine sun god was literally, pushing the planets around in their orbits.
Wow. So he found real empirical facts, like the planets actually do move the way he calculated, but he trapped those facts inside a primitive, semi-magical framework.
Right. And the source argues Freud did the exact same thing with the human mind. Freud lived in what the text calls the mythical era of his field. He observed very real mental phenomena, dreams, neuroses, slips of the tongue.
The classic Freudian slip.
Exactly. But instead of explaining them with rigorous biological causality, Freud invented an elaborate mythology to explain them away.
Which brings up the concept of the mind deities. That is such a vivid image. The essay claims that Freud's most famous concepts, the ego, the superego, eros, which is the life instinct, and thanatos, the death instinct, they aren't actual scientific realities residing inside your brain tissue.
Right. You can't point to them on an MRI.
Yeah. They are literal mind deities ruling our behavior, exactly the way the ancient Greek weather gods ruled from Mount Olympus.
It's a striking comparison. I mean, to an ancient Greek, a sudden lightning bolt was undeniable empirical proof that Zeus was angry.
Right.
And to a Freudian, a slip of the tongue or a neurotic symptom is undeniable proof of the id battling the superego. The text argues that Freud is simply taking complex neurological behavior and organizing it into glamorous, personalized entities.
The text even compares Freud's idea of the libido to outdated scientific myths. Like back in the 18th century, scientists couldn't explain how heat worked, so they believed heat was an invisible, magical fluid called caloric.
Yeah, this fluid that just moved between objects.
Exactly. Yeah. Or how early physicists talked about Newtonian gravity as this mysterious, ghostly pulling force before we actually understood the physics of space-time. The text says libido plays the exact same role. It's a mythical filler word used to explain away things we don't fully understand yet.
What's fascinating here is how the source addresses why people accept these myths using the concept of the crucial test. The essay brings up a brilliant litmus test for real science. In true science, hypotheses must be subjected to a crucial test against external reality.
Like Einstein's theory of relativity.
Exactly. It wasn't just a neat story on a chalkboard. It was tested by observing the actual bending of starlight during a solar eclipse. The theory could be measured, verified, or disproven by external reality.
That makes me think of debates over whether we all live in a computer simulation.
Oh, yeah.
It's a fun late-night conversation, but because there's absolutely no way to step outside the universe and check the code, we just argue in circles forever. No one can ever win with data because it's completely untestable.
That is the perfect analogy. The text compares Freud's theories to historical debates between Catholics and Protestants over the nature of the soul.
Right, because there's no chemical analysis you can do to test who is right.
Exactly. The crucial test for those religious theories only happens at the Last Judgment, which means never in this life. Because Freud's theories rely on invisible entities like the id and the censor, they are entirely untestable by external reality.
Which totally explains the massive splintering of the profession.
Yeah.
The text points out how the field of psychoanalysis was immediately torn apart by heretics, people like Carl Jung and Alfred Adler.
Yeah, they were Freud's top disciples, but then broke away to start their own competing schools of thought.
Right.
And the source notes that this kind of violent splintering doesn't really happen in real empirical science. Disciples of Darwin or Einstein don't form competing sects that attack the very foundations of the founders' work.
Because they can just test the new ideas.
Right. But because Freud couldn't put the it under a microscope, when someone like Jung disagreed with him, neither man could go to a lab and run a test to see who was right. The data just didn't exist.
So instead of refining a scientific theory, they essentially just excommunicated each other.
Yeah.
Like rival popes inventing their own competing myths.
Precisely. They just argue endlessly because none of it is anchored in measurable reality.
So if this author thinks Freud is just making up Greek gods for the brain, how do they actually think our brains work? Because the conversation naturally has to shift from mythology to actual physiological mechanics here.
It shifts to a much more evolutionary neurological approach. The text breaks down psychic phenomena into what it calls innervations.
Meaning what, exactly?
Nerve impulses, the literal physical firing of the nervous system. The text states that the unconscious part of our mind is made up of older, more archaic, automatic neural pathways.
Okay.
These are innate responses honed by ages of evolution. The conscious mind, however, is phylogenetically newer.
Whoa, phylogenetically. Let's translate that for us non-biologists.
Fair enough. It just means that in the grand timeline of human evolution, the conscious part of our brain developed much more recently.
Oh, got it.
It's the highly teachable, highly modifiable outer layer that adapts to new experiences, while the unconscious is the ancient, deeply ingrained foundational layer.
The essay uses this incredibly beautiful analogy of a piano chord to explain how they interact.
Yes, I love this part.
It says that when you strike a chord on a piano, the treble notes, the high notes you actively hear, are like the conscious mind. But the bass notes, the underlying acoustic foundation, represent the unconscious.
And the final sound isn't just those isolated strings.
Right. The final sound involves the entire system. The strings you didn't even strike are vibrating in sympathy. The wood of the piano is resonating. The air in the room is carrying the sound. Everything works together in a single, interconnected harmony.
It's a powerful image because it emphasizes unity. The treble and the bass are not enemies fighting each other. They are part of the exact same instrument, producing a single behavior.
Right. Every action we take has conscious and unconscious elements working together. But Freud doesn't see a harmony at all. It sounds like he treats the bass notes of our brain like a villain crashing a party.
Yeah, the critique argues he writes his entire theory from the prejudiced viewpoint of the conscious mind. Because of that, Freud treats the unconscious elements as wicked demons.
Wicked demons.
Yeah, he uses all these negative, disruptive terms. He calls the unconscious influence a distortion, an inhibition, an obsession, a compulsion. He paints a picture of dark, archaic forces bursting into the neat, ordered, rational world of consciousness just to ruin everything.
He's treating the engine of the car like it's a monster trying to destroy the vehicle.
Exactly.
He completely fails to realize that these aren't enemies. They're just two interconnected poles of a battery activating a single circuit.
Oh.
You need both to make the light bulb turn on.
He misses the harmony completely. He gets trapped in an irreconcilable dualism, seeing the mind as an internal battlefield between our evolutionary past and our civilized present, rather than seeing how the past is naturally synthesized to create the future.
So what does this all mean? It sounds like Freud is staring so closely at the internal wiring of the piano that he's completely forgetting the room the piano's sitting in. What is the massive piece of the puzzle that Freud is missing?
The environment. This is where the source bridges the gap from internal biology to external sociology.
Okay.
The text makes the fundamental Marxist argument that organisms never behave in a vacuum. You cannot study a human being isolated from their material world because we are constantly interacting with an environment that is rapidly changing.
And it's changing because of social production, right? Machines,
Yeah.
cities, transport, modern industry.
Exactly that. The essay states flatly that sociology must come before psychology. You have to understand the environment that is shaping the organism before you can possibly understand the organism's mind.
I love the analogy from the text here because it perfectly captures how blind they think Freud was to the outside world.
The bent trees analogy.
Yes. Imagine you are walking along a coastline and you see a row of trees, and every single tree is violently bent toward the ground in the exact same direction.
Right.
The text argues that Freud would look at those trees, completely ignore the howling ocean wind blowing against them, and he would diagnose the trees with a mysterious internal complex.
He'd say, these trees have a self-generated death instinct that makes them want to lean towards the dirt.
Exactly.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it exposes Freud's greatest error, according to this author. Freud looks at human culture and sees it as a mere projection of our internal instinctual drama. He thinks our internal id and ego build the society around us.
But the source flips this entirely on its head.
It does. It argues that society, the factories, the economic relations, those external material forces actually create and dictate the human psyche. The psyche is simply an organ of adaptation trying to survive the wind.
But that brings up a really crucial tension. If society is what shapes the mind, why does Freud think society and civilization are the ultimate enemies of our natural instincts?
This brings us to what the text calls the bourgeois illusion. The author claims this illusion is an underlying belief shared by many thinkers of Freud's era.
Okay, what is it?
The bourgeois illusion is the idea that human beings are naturally completely free in their wild, uncivilized state, and therefore any form of social organization, any rules or collective laws are just a prison house that restricts our natural pleasure-seeking instincts.
I see. So it's like a toddler thinking they're perfectly free when they try to run into a busy street and they view their parent grabbing their hand as a horrible, oppressive prison.
That captures the dynamic perfectly. Freud thinks we're all just animals who want to roam free and fulfill our desires, but society puts us in a cage of manners and laws, and that makes us miserable and neurotic.
Right.
But the text counters that an animal in a cage isn't actually free just because it doesn't realize it's caged. A wild animal is a slave to its blind, mechanical instinct.
It's at the mercy of starvation, predators, the weather.
Yes. True freedom, according to the text, only comes from understanding causality and utilizing civilization to control reality. Science and organization don't imprison us. They give us the tools to master our environment. By calling civilization a repression, Freud is fundamentally misunderstanding what freedom actually is.
Here's where it gets really interesting and honestly quite dark, because the text doesn't just call Freud pessimistic for this view.
No, it goes much further.
It makes the extreme leap of claiming that Freud's theories unwittingly wrote the charter for fascism. I can see how viewing humanity as animals in a cage leads to a grim worldview. But fascism? How do they connect those dots?
It all comes down to how people behave during a societal collapse. Because Freud believes that civilization is doomed to an endless, unsolvable struggle between our destructive death instincts and our life instincts, he offers no scientific way forward.
Right.
He believes that social cohesion doesn't come from shared rational goals, but from blind emotional identification with a dominant father figure.
So his theory strips away the hope of collective reason.
Exactly. The text argues that when the society hits a massive crisis like an economic depression, mass unemployment, social decay, Freud's philosophy tells people there is no rational organizational solution.
Because it's all just internal demons.
Right. It tells them their intellect is just a weak slave to their dark, feral instincts. And when people believe their base instincts are evil and uncontrollable, they crave an iron-fisted ruler to control those instincts for them.
They abandon logic and regress.
They regress to a barbaric, savage past. They look for a strong, mythological father figure to bash those instincts into submission and emotionally bind the herd together. The text points out that this regressive, emotionally driven herd mentality is the exact psychological mechanism that powers fascism.
Wow. So by telling people they are fundamentally irrational, he leaves them completely vulnerable to authoritarian myths.
The source is careful to note the historical irony here, though. Freud's own books were burned by the fascist regimes his theories supposedly paved the way for. He was not an ally to them. But because his psychology lacks material scientific basis, it can only diagnose the decay. It offers a philosophy of despair instead of a cure.
Which perfectly sets up our final big question. If the wind, the external environment, and capitalist society are the actual root causes of our mental distress, can lying on a psychoanalyst's couch actually do anything to help you?
Right.
Because this essay has a brutal critique of individual therapy.
It is scathing. The text looks at the proposed solutions of the psychoanalysts and finds them completely absurd given the massive scale of the problem. It mentions Alfred Adler, who saw that industrialized society was causing mass demoralization. And Adler's grand solution, he suggested establishing a chair of curative pedagogy.
A teaching chair. The text literally mocks this. It says it's like taking pedagogic pills to cure the earthquake of capitalism's collapse. It's like trying to stop a tsunami with a beach umbrella.
And Freud wasn't much better in their eyes. His solution was that individuals, if they were rich enough, should pay a doctor for years of personal analysis.
Right.
The author says trying to cure societal misery by psychoanalyzing individuals one by one is like trying to lift yourself off the ground by pulling on your own bootlaces. It defies the laws of physics.
Hang on, I struggle with this part. Millions of people go to therapy and get actual tangible relief. They learn coping mechanisms. They process trauma. You can't just write off the entire medical profession as useless simply because they aren't out there overthrowing the global economy.
And the source anticipates that exact defense. It acknowledges that defenders of Freud will say, neurosis is an emotional crisis, so we have to use these emotional therapies to cure them.
Which makes sense.
But the text counters by redefining what emotion actually is. It argues that human emotion isn't just a quirky personal feeling inside your head. It is a mighty, creative social force shaped by eons of collective human history.
It's the energy of society itself.
Right. So the text asks, is it not incredibly arrogant to think that one earnest, middle-aged physician sitting in an armchair can harness or reshape that massive societal force in a single patient just by talking to them? The text uses this incredible phrase, you cannot bring down the houses of London with a shout.
That's a great line.
You cannot fundamentally change the shape of a person's psyche while leaving the crushing environment that deformed them completely intact. The ultimate conclusion of the essay is that you must change the world in order to change yourself.
Man, that is a heavy, heavy takeaway. Let's summarize the journey we've been on today for you, the listener. We've explored a deeply radical critique that paints Sigmund Freud not as the pioneer of scientific psychology, but as a religious mythmaker.
Yeah.
The text argues that he accurately diagnosed the immense distress of modern society, but he fundamentally failed to cure it. Why? Because he blamed invisible internal demons inside our brains, rather than pointing the finger at the external environment, the material world that was actually causing the pain. He saw the bent trees, but he completely ignored the wind.
And by ignoring the wind, he traps psychology in a cage of pessimism, offering individual bootlace bullying as a solution to structural earthquakes.
We want to ask you to reflect on your own life for a moment. Think about a time when you felt incredibly stressed, anxious, or overwhelmed. When you feel that way, do you instantly view it as a personal, internal failure of your own mind? Do you blame your own biology or your own lack of resilience?
Or do you look at the wind?
Exactly. Do you look at your societal environment, the crushing demands of your workplace, the economic structure of the modern world, and recognize the external forces that might be bending your tree?
And to leave you with one final provocative thought, to mull over something that builds on this source but brings it right up to the present second.
Okay, let's hear it.
The author of this text argued that our psychology is entirely shaped by our rapidly changing material environment. Machines, transport, industrial cities. They believed our minds are just reflections of our external tools and social relations. If that is true, what is currently happening to the human psyche right now? What happens as our primary environment transitions away from the physical world of bricks and machines and into the completely virtual, algorithmic, and infinite spaces of the internet? If the environment dictates the mind, what kind of mind does the algorithm build?
Oh man, that is a question that will definitely keep me up tonight. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the world around you, keep looking for the win, and we will see you next time.